5:30. Thank you. Okay, Lori, take it away.
Hi, everybody. My name is Lori Pond, and I'm one of Pasadena Photography Arts advisors. I'd like to welcome you all to our latest forum Zoom talk with photographer artist Fred Brashear Jr. as he discusses his work, Uncertain Future, A Species in Peril. This installment of Forum is being presented without an underwriter. Pasadena Photography Arts depends a large part on the generosity of our viewers. If you would like to make a donation to our organization or underwrite one of our future events, please go to our website, pasadenaphotographyarts.org. From the beginning, Pasadena Photography Arts has been dedicated to fostering the photography community in the east side of Los Angeles. And community means giving back. Here at PPA, we support the following organizations that create and highlight the varied and wonderful photography scene in the Great Basin of Los Angeles. Keep your eyes glued. Submissions will be accepted soon for the third annual 2025 Pasadena Photography Arts Photo Award. The winner will receive $2,000. And here's one great way you can help out the Mojave Desert Land Trust and the Center for Biological Diversity. For $50, you can receive a signed 8 by 10-inch print of Fred Brashear's image, Strong Resilient, which you can see right now on the screen. And with that, I am going to introduce you to our artist, Fred Brashear Jr. Fred Brashear Jr. is a multiracial, multidisciplinary, photo-based artist whose work explores the interconnectedness between humans and nature, highlighting how the treatment of one subject directly affects the other. Through his work, Brashear connects the historical trauma of racial inequality and iniquity to the current environmental, social, and political issues surrounding land use and stewardship. Inquiry into these sensitive topics allows Brashear to explore his own personal history of trauma and loss. Brashear has exhibited his photographic work in London, Rome, New York, and Los Angeles. Brashear lives in Southern California and currently teaches photography at Cypress College, Cerritos College, and the University of La Verne. Fred, it's your time to shine.
Thank you, Lori. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for the Pasadena Photography Arts for allowing me to present my work today. If I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right. And so let's just go ahead and begin. Uncertain Future, A Species in Peril is roughly a 9-year project that accumulates a bunch of different projects photographically and artistically.
Sorry, Fred, you're not full screen.
I'm not full screen.
Mm-mm.
Is that full screen?
Nope, we
Start
still
over.
we still see your presenter view.
Oh,
It's okay. It's a normal.
There we go.
Okay, there we go. Okay. Small technical difficulties, right? Okay, so my work will basically, there we go. All experiences have mattered, right? We talk about the desert biome, the major threats, and my artistic answers, a call for change, and the moving forward. And so in my experience, growing up, I lived a childhood outside. And so I was always in climbing trees. I was always playing in the woods, whatever the case may be. artistically, art entered my life at a very early age. My mother was a huge influence into that, and so were my uncles on my mother's side. And basically, it was always, creating, working, playing, doing whatever it was. That's the best way I learned how to learn as a child, was through arts and crafts. Unfortunately, when I was 8.5, my mother passed away. And so that artistic influence left my life while my father took the majority of guiding me and mentoring me and raising me as a young man. He instilled in me that I needed to work with my hands. I needed to work, have a solid job and solid career. And it was that direction that led me from there on out. At the age of 17, unfortunately, my father passed away as well. And so, what my mother had instilled in me as a young man, and as what my father instilled in me as an older adult, I basically went into firefighting. And I worked on a wildland helicopter crew for the Bureau of Land Management out in actually Apple Valley, which is where our base was at. So it was the CCD, which is the California Desert District. And so through that experience, I learned mostly about the desert environment, the plants, and the certain laws that were instilled through firefighting. And so I worked as a firefighter for a number of years. And once that career ended, I went full bore into photography, and firefighting was actually the way that I had gotten into photography. And so some of my photos are right here on the screen right now. And basically, I had a little point and shoot camera, and every place that we would stop, I would buy a new camera and I would photograph and document the trips that we went on and the journeys and the fires that we fought. And so once that career ended, I went full bore into the education side and took every photo class that I could possibly take at the time. And so with that, I started photographing the desert. We were living in the desert at the time. First, it was Victorville, and then it was in Hesperia. And so what I started noticing was, the history behind the Joshua tree, and started really kind of diving in and thinking about it. Right. So the desert biome, you know, the history of the Joshua tree dates back to the Pleistocene era, which is 11,700 to about 2.6 million years ago. Right. That period of time was a much wetter and cooler climate. At the end of that era marked a great extinction for species. And so including the major seed distributor at the time, which was the giant ground sloth, and now it's going to be mostly rodents for where we're at nowadays. The plant gradually adapted to the arid climate. And so it's important to note that this plant only exists in the Mojave Desert. And now there are speculations, in other places, Jerusalem, Israel, and Mexico. But those are definitely a part of the agave family, but they are not Joshua trees. And so, following the history of the Joshua tree and understanding the way that it grows the most in its first year, right, up to 3 inches. And after that, it usually grows 1 inch a year. And it's actually not a tree at all. Like I said, it's part of the agave family. So what that means is that it doesn't have growth rings. So it's very difficult to determine how old a tree is based upon that idea of looking at a growth ring as a normal tree. And it's very compact fibers is the way that a Joshua tree grows. And so it's, what happens is that, with this plant, with this dense material, we have to go off of the age of basically the size of the tree. Now, the major pollinator for the Joshua tree is the yucca moth. And now it's important to state that we don't get to necessarily talk about the Joshua tree without talking about the yucca moth. They have this mutualistic relationship in which the yucca moth will actually pollinate the flowers of the Joshua tree. In return, the Joshua tree offers up some seeds in which the moth will lay its eggs and basically be able to reproduce and have its own offspring as well. And the other seeds of the Joshua tree will end up pollinating and growing to a full maturity. And so now, with some of that history, you have my history of how I became an artist and brief history, and have some of the brief history of the Joshua tree. Now it's important to me to talk about the major threats. And now the major threats to Joshua trees are going to be vandalism, climate change, and urban development. But before we get into that, this is a very poignant statement by author and essayist Barry Lopez. And diversity is not a characteristic of life. It is a condition necessary for life. To eliminate diversity would be like eliminating carbon and expecting life to go on. This, I believe, is why even a passing acquaintance to endangered languages or endangered species or endangered cultures brings with it so much anxiety, so much sadness. We know in our tissues that the fewer the differences we encounter wherever it is we go, the more widespread the kingdom of death has become. And that quote from his book, Embrace Fearlessly the Burning World, really was, I think, poignant for my work and for kind of guiding me in the direction as far as protecting the Joshua trees is concerned. And so, like I mentioned, the major threats are going to be urban development and human encroachment, vandalism, invasive species endangering native flora, right, which is going to increase the fire loads, impact of climate change on desert ecosystems. And with all of these things, there is the possibility of no Joshua trees in Joshua Tree National Park within 100 years, which is quite frightening if we really put that into perspective. So the major threats, right? In 2020, a lightning strike happened, and it was called the Dome Fire in the Mojave Preserve. Now, I did not fight this fire. I was done firefighting at this time, and I was basically photographing. And I went after the fire had ceased and it was kind of moved away. And this fire was caused by a lightning strike. The invasive grasses contributed to the fire load. The lack of resources. California was on fire everywhere that year, and most of the resources were scattered throughout northern part of California and elsewhere. And so the resources were very limited, and the response was very limited in the initial attack for this fire. And so because of the winds, because of the terrain, this fire burned roughly over 43,000 acres, 43,273 acres, and 1.3 million Joshua trees were killed with this fire. Now, the source comes from the National Park Service, and the reason why that we have such a specific number as far as the Joshua trees killed in this fire was basically because they had been doing studies in that area and had been counting the Joshua trees prior to the fire. Another fire, the York Fire, right, in Mojave Preserve to 2023. Cause of fire was undetermined at this time. Burned roughly 93 acres, 93.073 or 73 acres burned, right? It was inconclusive as to the exact number of trees burned or lost because they were not doing any kind of surveying or monitoring in this area. But according to the National Park Service, at least several 100,000 were either burned or damaged due to the fire. Vandalism. In 2015, I was kind of in between what I really wanted to do as a career. I had stopped firefighting and I had gone to school, and I was trying to decide whether or not I really wanted to become a photographer and an artist. And so I used to go on these long walks in the Mojave Desert and around my neighborhood. And so as I started walking, I started noticing very disturbing trends of Joshua trees being cut down for no reason at all. And this is one such subject. And now there has been no construction in this area. There was no construction. There was no planned construction. And so someone just deliberately went out there with a chainsaw and ended up cutting down this glorious tree. And now, if you can imagine the age of this tree, like I said, they grow their fastest in their first year up to 3 inches, and about an inch a year after that. And so this tree was hundreds and hundreds of years old prior to being destroyed. And so, in addition to the vandalism, I was also noticing great upheaval in the landscape itself. And so I started noticing, clear swaths of land that were being, all the vegetation was basically being removed. And so this was because of what is called the Tapestry Project. Now, the Tapestry Project is a master plan community just outside of or inside the city limits of Hesperia, just on the other side of the San Bernardino National Forest. And it is now called Silverwood. Okay, so when this project first started, it's roughly 9,366 acres. And it had the estimated residential units at 15,663. Okay. And it was going to affect at least 588.7 acres of Joshua Tree habitat. Now, this was in 2019. Now, there was talks of mitigating this project. I don't know if those mitigations ever came to attrition, only because COVID happened and I lost touch with the project after moving away from Hesperia. And so, as I was documenting this master plan community, what I was really noticing was the infrastructure that was going in for the development of this community. So it happened to be the upkick of gas stations, of fast food restaurants, road widening, right? And so this happened to be one of the areas in which they had clear cut. Now, what they go in and do in the city of Hesperia at that time is they would go in and basically remove all of the other vegetation, leaving these little islands of these Joshua trees. So they kind of give you this sense of hope, but there was actually no hope because eventually these trees were removed. Now, the interesting thing about the city of Hesperia is that through research, I discovered that the developers in Hesperia have one of three options for Joshua trees. They can either A, work around the Joshua trees and redesign their plans for their development. B, they can remove and relocate these Joshua trees, but they have to monitor for up to a year. Or C, they could basically remove the tree altogether and then pay a fine. And I believe at that time it was $300, which is really nothing for in the bigger scheme of these multi-million-dollar corporations that were going in there for development. And so these islands were there, and now these trees, the most devastating thing is because, like I said, these trees were not damaged. These trees were healthy, and there was a sense of them being, hopefully saved or removed. The unfortunate thing is that these trees were tagged. I have no record as to where those trees and those tags have gone, even if they are still alive. Joshua trees do not do very well when they're relocated. And so there is no information as far as I can find for these trees. And so, like I said, they would remove everything and basically clear cut. Now, they were removing all of the vegetation. So you can see there in the lower right-hand corner is basically a juniper bush that was crushed, that was still in the ground. And so they would clear cut everything. Now, the most disturbing thing about this development was that $300 fine. So what they were doing is that these developers were basically ripping up the Joshua trees and then they were piling them up. And so in 2015, I came across a pile such as this, and I asked the construction crew if I can have some of the material. And then after some deliberation, they agreed. And so I was able to take some of the Joshua tree material at that time. Now, I sat on it for quite a bit because I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do with it. And I knew that I wanted to do something. And so I started doing some research, and I thought about at first maybe making a sculpture or doing something like that because of my background in art, but it just didn't feel right. So I sat on the material, and then I came to the conclusion of, this idea of making paper. I figured that, wood is a main source of paper, and so why couldn't Joshua trees be a source of this paper? And so through a process of boiling, blending, and basically shredding, I came up with my own process for using the material and making my own paper. And so um, I started pulping it, and basically from the collected material. Now it's important to mention that all the material that I collected, this was the only time I've ever collected Joshua Tree material, and I've never collected any Joshua Tree material since. And so with this paper, I started off small at first, um, with very small print. So this is an 8 by 10 inch print that I made with a digital lift transfer. And then as I refined my practice of paper making with this material, I went much larger. And then I also started printing in color. And so this print is actually 18 by 24 inches. And I've gone larger, it's 14 by 32. Now, I still have some of the material left from that original collection in 2015. Once this project is completely done and all the material is used, I have plan on donating the entire collection to a organization that will help promote sustainability for endemic species throughout the world, if not just the Mojave Desert. Now, in regards to the other landscape items that were there, the other plants, the junipers and the sagebrush and the creosote, um, they were pulling those up as well. Now, these were less restrictive, so I knew that I didn't necessarily need permission. So I collected some of these materials, and I thought to myself, okay, well, what can I do with these materials in addition to making this Joshua Tree paper? And so what I started to do is I started to create work in which the landscape was able to have a voice for itself. And so basically what I did is I created kind of a tongue-in-cheek here, these tapestries after the said project that removed this plant material. And I was basically doing pigment transfers onto natural fibers and natural materials. And so what we have here on the left is creosote, and on the right you have some creosote, and then you also have desert bluebells as well. And so through this process of heating and steaming, I was able to transfer the pigments of these plants onto these tapestries. And you can see the size of them. I started off small with 2 feet by 5 feet, and then eventually went 6 feet wide by 20 feet high, and was basically making these tapestries that hung down from the ceiling. As COVID hit, and of course we all went on lockdown, that was a very trying time for me as far as going out and creating work, especially on a landscape in which I love so much. And so once the restrictions started to kind of settle down, I immediately went out to the Wee Thump area, which is in between Searchlight and Nipton off of the 15 freeway heading into Las Vegas. And so I started photographing the Joshua trees with a 4x5 camera and documenting this location of the Western Joshua tree. And so moving around as I photographed, I started photographing also in Joshua Tree National Park. Now, it's important to say I love Joshua Tree National Park, but as an artist, it is completely packed. And so it's very difficult to find these shots where you're kind of alone and you don't have anyone around you. And so I much prefer to be out in the Mojave Desert somewhere where I could be out there for all day long and not see a single soul. But this tree that we're looking at on the screen right now is the tallest tree in Joshua Tree National Park, if not in the world, and stands at roughly 43 feet tall. Um, It's right off of Queen Valley Road, I believe it is. Um, on the western side of Joshua Tree National Park. And so, of course, looking at everything was Joshua Tree, right? And so now it's this call for change. And, as you can see, it's kind of ironic and kind of his hypocrisy that these developments were doing is that they would tear down a Joshua Tree forest and disturb the landscape, but they would put up a building and then have the audacity to put in a picture of a Joshua tree in the window, right? And so this call for change came about with the Center for Biological Diversity and introducing myself and getting introduced to Brendan Cummings. And so Brendan Cummings is the director for the Center of Biological Diversity. And the way that this came to be was through Eco Art Space on a discussion that we had on, I believe it was called Tree Talk. And my mentor and friend, Sant Khalsa, had hosted this and brought together a great group of people that were all about protecting and preserving Joshua trees. And so in 2020, I can't remember when, I want to say September of 2020, the Western Joshua Tree Conservation Act was presented to the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And at that time, it was refused federal protection, but we still had the idea of getting it pushed through for the state. And so the California Fish and Game Commission were basically deliberating on whether or not to pass it. And so a bunch of artists in 2022, along with scientists, activists, we all provided documentation of proof for the state protection based on some of my photography. Now, in 2015, this is really where, in addition to the vandalism, this is where it really kind of hit home for me, is because I first started photographing the trees in 2015. And so this was a tree that I came across. And as you can see, it's protected, it's tagged. So it was basically monitored and ready for removal. And so I came back in 2018 when the development of the Tapestry Project started to take hold. And I found one tree 6'4", basically ripped off and basically broken at the root bowl and thrown into the bush in which it was growing in. And so these are some of the photos that I had submitted in that portfolio that helped the Western Tree Conservation Act get passed and put through. But I didn't do it alone. So it's not protected under the Endangered Species Act, so it has no federal protection. And so in July, it was passed of 2023, which was of great relief for me and for everyone else that cares about these Joshua trees. And so it offered state protection for the Western Joshua tree, which is Yucca brevifolia. Now, it's important to mention that there are two types of Joshua trees. We've got the Yucca brevifolia and Yucca brevifolia jagerina. And jagerina is basically the Eastern Joshua tree. And so this state protection is for the Western Joshua tree. And so along the lines of this Endangered Species Act, it was the first in the state of California for climate threatened species. So yay for that. Now, this call for change again. Now, California has its state protection, but unfortunately, in other areas of the Mojave Desert that have Joshua trees, basically Nevada, Arizona, and Utah, the California state protection does not apply. And so there are other laws in place, but they're a lot looser than what we have here in California. And so there's this huge gray area for collecting, selling, and the possession of the Joshua tree. And so as you can see here on the screen right now, this was a Joshua tree that I found on Etsy for only $249. It's 2 feet high, and it was from the state of Nevada. Now, what's interesting about these other states in Nevada, Utah, and Arizona is that you can apply through the local organization and get a permit to collect and be able to sell. And so we have this idea now of state versus federal land. So we have these protections here in California, but elsewhere these protections are not necessarily adhered to. And so there's this huge gray area, which is kind of funny because living here in California, it's illegal for us to possess it. It's illegal for us to chop it down. It's illegal for us to move it in any way, shape, or form without the proper authorities being notified or the permission. So you can sell it in other areas, but it's illegal, so you can't really buy it here in California, right? And so it's really kind of this strange gray area. And so California basically prohibits the import, export, take or kill, possession, purchase or sale of the Western Joshua tree or any part or product of the tree without proper authorization. All right. In Nevada, they require the tag to be affixed to these trees in most situations. It is illegal to sell or purchase collected trees without these permits. So I don't know if that tree that we just saw had a permit or not. I don't know. In Nevada, also, Joshua trees and cactus permits are for personal use only. This means that the plant collected under these permits cannot be sold, resold, bartered, traded, or utilized in any way for monetary gain. Arizona and Utah, the state laws vary as well, right? And so as you can see now, in this push to protect Joshua trees, there needs to be this universal system in which Joshua trees, both Eastern and Western, are protected from these illegal trade and sales. And so artistically moving forward, once the Joshua Tree Act passed, I felt this great sense of relief. And I started looking at the Joshua tree from a perspective of the tree not necessarily having to worry about its place in the universe anymore. And so I started photographing to beat the heat. I usually go out during the summer. I started photographing the Joshua tree at night. And so what I would want to do is basically, I created this body of work that was titled Why the Stars Look Down. And so this creates this idea of the Joshua tree sitting there and basically being left alone and just being able to grow under the stars. And while the stars are the only ones that notice the change and see the physical change of these trees. And so, in addition to that, I started revisiting my old ideas and my personal family history of trauma, right? And looking at the Joshua tree grows that lay outside the state protection on the fringes of the Mojave Desert in Nevada, Arizona, and Utah. And so thinking about these events that have passed while Joshua trees have existed. So I started thinking about these correlations between my own family history and the Joshua tree. And so this is a map of the different areas in which I would research and I would go and I would photograph, and I still do photograph. And as you can see, throughout California, Arizona, Utah, and Nevada. I am happy to say that in my explorations, I did come across the Area 51 perimeter fence in 2023, and I am happy to say that Joshua trees are well protected in this area. And so, speaking about revisiting my own history, I started looking at the Joshua trees as subjects, not just objects. And so I started really to relate them to my own family members and friends and people that I have lost due to the systematic violence of police brutality, drugs, disease, whatever the case may be. And so what I started to revisit was this idea of creating crime scenes of the Joshua trees. And so all the Joshua trees that I found that were basically laying on the ground, I would cover with a white sheet and then put up some crime scene tape in order to recreate this idea and this traumatic experience that I ended up living through. And so going through and finding different locations in which to recreate these scenes and kind of create this personality and this subject value for the Joshua trees and their habitat. And so as you can see, they really do look like human figures underneath these sheets. And I do consider each one of them to have a personality, and each tree to have its own life force. And so regressing, looking back at, this idea of Joshua trees just existing and the stars looking down, I started to use homemade lights and homemade colored filters in which I would light and illuminate the Joshua trees and photograph them against the star background of the night sky. And so looking at, just their presence in this environment. Now, the interesting thing is that we always visit the desert during the daytime, but at night is when the desert actually comes alive. And so what was so fascinating while doing this project was the fact that you can hear the wildlife start to move. You can hear rodents moving around, and now it kind of creates this unearthly feeling, because as humans we don't get to really see in the dark. And so um it really was interesting to be in that environment and be in that setting with the Joshua trees and this desert wildlife that would come alive at night, and photographing it in this environment. And as you can see, I started really kind of looking at the idea of not only the Joshua tree being in this environment and existing, but also kind of playing with the idea of it being a key component. And so we have the three primary colors of illuminated the Joshua tree, that I'm really looking at the idea of it being a key species, the premier species for the Mojave Desert, for the yucca moth, for ground squirrels, for rodents, for whatever else desert wildlife uses the Joshua tree for nutrients and shelter. And so now what's really interesting is the Aratina project. Now, the Aratina project came about in June of 2024. It was pushed through legislature rather quickly because of the it was put through as an emergency order to bypass the Joshua Tree Conservation Act, basically. And so the major concerns are that it's on 2,700 acres. Over 4,000 Joshua trees are threatened by this development. And what else? Something else that's very, very alarming is that with the removal of these Joshua trees for this solar plant, basically there's a fear for the town of Boron, which is a very small unincorporated town in Kern County, for the effects of valley fever. Now, valley fever is a fungal a spore that lives basically in the soil, and when the soil is disturbed with the removal of Joshua trees and the construction of solar panels, the bare earth and the winds will blow this dust into boron, creating illness and sickness for those that live there. And so I started documenting from the very beginning the first signs of the fragmentation of the desert, the fencing off. This was July. As you can see, they started putting up chain link fences as far as the outer perimeter. And then in August, they started putting up more specific fencing and permanent fencing that basically blocks not only your view, but also blocks and stops the migration of any wildlife that could possibly want, especially the desert tortoise that wanted to migrate. And so Unfortunately, with the start of the school year, I have not been able to go out there as of recently. So I have no idea. There's word that Joshua trees have been removed. Now, the scary thing is that the Arantina project, basically what they wanted to do is they wanted to destroy the Joshua trees on site and ripping them out of the ground and shredding them right then and there so that the public would not be able to watch the transportation and removal of these trees. And so um, legislature has kind of fought back against this development, and I know that the city of Boron, the town of Boron, has actually fought back as well. And last I heard that there was they were going to try to mitigate the loss of the Joshua trees in this area. And so my documentation will continue. As long as Joshua trees are threatened, I will continue to document their existence and what threatens them. I really consider them subjects, not objects. I look at them as entities onto their own that contribute not only to our own health, but we need to contribute to theirs. And this idea of harmony in nature, in which I really truly believe that we need to start thinking more that we are a part of nature rather than being a part of nature, right? Or from nature. And so um these these projects, there are more solar projects that are planned for the future. And I'm hoping that we can help mitigate the loss of Joshua trees. Um, Currently, there is an exhibition and publication, Desert Forest Life with Joshua Trees, and it's part of the Pacific Standard Times Art and Science Collide. And it's part of the Getty Initiative. And it opened on September 7th and runs all the way through December 29th. 2024 at MOA Lancaster. And so if you are, I highly recommend going and seeing the show. It's a beautiful, beautiful exhibition of Joshua tree art that I could not even have imagined people creating. And it's just a beautiful, beautiful show. Thank you all for being here. Thank you all for sitting through my talk. And I will stop sharing.
I noticed there were a couple of questions in the chat for you.
Okay.
And Ian Wright says, hey, how can we help? And we told him to buy a print. But what else can people do at this point to be active in the fight to save the Joshua tree?
Get involved. I think that with the Mojave Desert in general, not just the Joshua tree, I believe that there is this great misconception of it being a wasteland, and that there is this idea that, you know, oh, it's the desert. Life doesn't exist in the desert, but obviously it does, right? I think that, you know, understanding, educating themselves and others about the idea of the desert, that it is an important aspect of our ecosystem. It's a huge carbon sink that, you know, eliminates the carbon from the atmosphere and reproduces it in other ways. And so it's you know, it's very important. I think that the Mojave Desert Land Trust, one of the organizations that I'm donating to, they offer volunteer opportunities. And then also knowing the laws and understanding what it means for these Joshua trees and the actual loss of the possible loss of these Joshua trees.
Is there a membership that you can join, either the Center for Biological Diversity or the Mojave Land Trust?
Yes, there are. Yes, there are.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think we have the links for those in here. There was an interesting comment that came in. Do you plan to seek out getting federal protection just like you did for state protection?
we would love, I think there's this idea for federal protection, but I think right now, yes, I think that's on the idea, um, or on the agenda. Uh,
Uh-huh.
I think what's important right now is to make sure that the laws here in California are upheld. And and that's what's so alarming with the Aratina Solar Project right now is that they were able to circumvent the Joshua Tree Conservation Act and push through to this emergency initiative for solar power and solar development. And so,
Mhm.
I think that's the most alarming thing that we have to kind of focus on right now.
Someone commented that Aratina has cut down a Joshua Tree forest, which is it's just heartbreaking to hear that.
Yeah.
I mentioned to you when we corresponded that my sister used to live in Joshua Tree in the 70s,
Right.
and no one at that time really cared about Joshua trees. They were just there, they were part of the landscape, and nobody thought anything of them. Nobody was cutting them down. They were just there. People left them alone, and there weren't the hordes of visitors either. Um, so it's really doubly heartbreaking for me to hear about all these changes that have happened. I'm wondering if you can tie together for me the biggest way in which you're relating land use slash stewardship issues to racial inequality.
Absolutely. I think it stems from gentrification in inner city developments. I think that, historically, inner city has been brown and black populated. And with this idea of land boom that's happening here, and especially in Southern California, where these families are able to sell their family homes for millions and millions of dollars on which this land is sitting, they basically, what is happening is that they're able to go ahead, sell that property, and then unfortunately they move to the desert, but they have no experience in the desert environment. And
Yeah.
so there are no jobs in the desert environment per se. And so that's the reason why there's so much traffic in the Cajon Pass, and there's so much traffic that's, coming and going from Lancaster and Palmdale and all of these places, because most of the jobs, they relocate, but they don't relocate their job, right? Job
Right,
security is
right.
important. So it's very, very difficult. And I think that, in regards to looking at the land as just this wasteland, I mean, we can go into a whole spiral of how brown and black people have been, disenfranchised because they've been viewed as lesser.
Yeah, and they also received less education regarding, protecting our natural habitats.
Right.
I mean, that was never introduced. Um,
Laurie, I have a question.
yeah,
Fred, I come from a country where most of our energy comes from sustainable sources, way over 50%. Um, is there any way that Joshua trees and solar farms can coexist, even if it makes them slightly less efficient, but better for the environment?
Ian, I'll be completely honest with you. Yes, don't develop where they grow. I mean, there are huge swaths of land in the desert where Joshua trees don't grow. And but the fact that we gobble up this land, these corporations gobble up this land, and then pretend to say that they are doing it for the environment and doing it for these things. It's disingenuous, because the reality is that, with the production of solar panels require high quality quartz and high quality carbon. And so the misconception is that solar panels are made of silicon, which they are not. And these high quality quartz and high quality carbon are actually mined in the East, in West Virginia and North Carolina. And so what we are basically doing here is we're saying that, yeah, we want to be able to protect our environment, but we're also causing harm in another environment because of the mining practices. And so I think that one of the biggest things that we need to do is either find a sustainable way in which to make the solar panel, and B, I think we need to be able to develop the solar panel on existing properties that don't have Joshua trees. I think it's as simple as that.
Mhm.
I just want to recognize that the topic is so important and compelling. It's easy to overlook your photography. I just want to recognize the fantastic photography that you've produced as well.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you.
Fred, this is Bill Wishner. First of all, I thank you for your presentation. I must admit, I'm a little embarrassed living in Southern California for as long as I have. I really didn't know the history of Joshua trees or their value to us in all the ways you've proposed. I also want to say that you are a fabulous example of visual activism. And, we always think of visual activism in terms of the political scene, of the conflict photography, and many other ways. Rarely do we ever look at or consider that visual activism in the natural world is equally important, or maybe more important ultimately to us than the visual activism in the other areas. So thank you for presenting that in the way you did. And I applaud you for what you've done and what you will do going forward in the future.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you. That means
There's
a
a
lot.
question from Jessica, and she asks, was there a specific moment or photograph that made you change the way you view the Joshua trees as subjects rather than just objects? It's such an interesting concept that I would love to see more of.
I think that walking upon the tree that was vandalized and cut down for no reason whatsoever, I think really was it broke my heart at that point.
Yeah.
That's, you can deal with certain things, but for just the lack of care and the lack of empathy towards a tree that was hundreds of years old, and just to be, chopped down in a matter of seconds is very, very, just was very traumatic for me.
Yeah, it's like a personal violation in a way to see that.
Yeah.
When I saw that, my heart just sank. It was such a devastating photo. You've really had a great way of documenting in so many different ways the destruction of the Joshua tree. And you've also, I love your series with the colored lights, because you're putting the Joshua tree in this like regal position. It's like, here I am, I belong here, and I'm pretty to look at. And
Absolutely.
it just that was the lighthearted moment of your talk when I saw the spotlights on the Joshua trees. They were so beautiful. I'm kind of disappointed you weren't able to show more of your handmade paper prints on your presentation, because I think those are really striking.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm wondering how you learned how to do that process.
It was a trial and error for about a year and a half. I did research. At that time when I was doing it, it's so funny how things kind of comes full circle. Through the exhibition at MOA, I learned that Carlton Watkins had come out to the Mojave Desert and was documenting the Joshua trees for actually, he was actually looking at them as a possible source for paper money back then in the
What? Oh my
1910s, right? And so you can just imagine. But
Yeah.
for me, it was just, I really wanted to do justice to the material in which I had collected, and I didn't want this tree to just basically die in vain.
Yeah.
And so I basically wanted to create something that was not only of the desert, but also for the desert in return. And so this process, it was, like I said, it was a year and a half. I played with different ways, and the only way to really reduce the fiber is to boil it in a solution of soda ash, which releases the cellulose compounds. And
That
then
sounds like a lot of education right there. How did you figure that out?
just researching. I started looking at, how to make paper, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And so, how to make paper from scratch, and and a lot of links led to oh, recycled paper, and I'm like, well, this is not recycled.
Oh, great. Here's some
Oh, here they are.
examples of your work with the handmade paper. Excuse me.
Yeah, and so it was just a process, and then once I figured out how to make the paper, the other process for it was, okay, well, what do I want to do with this paper? And so I initially had thought maybe I should just print on it, but I was terrified
Yes.
to death of putting it through a printer. And so I started looking at these different ways and came up with my own way of doing a lift transfer, in which I was able to layer it with a matte medium and then remove the paper from the paper backing, and I had almost this transparency that I was able to adhere to the paper.
It's amazing. So you didn't put it through a printer, as it
No.
turned out. So that's good, because the printer wouldn't have liked that, I don't think.
No, and I don't think my schools would have liked that either.
Right, right. So what's the reaction been to your students, by your students, to your work? I assume they know all about it,
They
hopefully.
do. They do. I think the reaction is one of wonder. I think a lot of times they get kind of locked in as to what photography is, not to what photography can be. And
Mm-hmm.
so I think that I would like to hope that I open doorways in which students are allowed to be more creative in their
Yeah,
photographic
yeah,
adventures.
yeah. As a side note, I was a realtor for a while, and I look at what's happening out in the Mojave Desert, and I blame the real estate market for, partly for the destruction of the Joshua trees, for overpriced homes that force people to move farther and farther away, and the lack of building new homes in the past 20 years has inflated prices. I mean, it's just this endless spiral, and I'm so aggrieved to see the real estate market causing this widespread destruction of our natural resources. So I blame them. I'm not a realtor anymore, so I can blame them. um, so that concludes our forum for tonight. Thank you very much for all of your wonderful presentation. And again, I would like to impress upon people that you can make a difference in terms of saving nature. All it takes is one person doing one thing. And as that one person adds to another person, and that's how we get things done. So I would strongly advise you all to invest in Fred Brashear's beautiful print, Strong Resilient. It's only $50. It's 8 by 10 inches, and it's signed. And the best part, in addition to getting a beautiful photograph, 100% of the proceeds will go to the Mojave Desert Land Trust and the Center for Biological Diversity. So please email pasadena.photoarts@gmail.com to get your own print.
Yep.
Thank you
Thank you so much,
much.
everybody.
Thank you.
Great presentation.
Bye.
Thank you for everybody for coming.
Have a great night.
Have a great night.